Bismillah, alhamdulillah, wassalatu wassalamu ala rasulillah wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam. All praise due to Allah, may Allah send His peace and blessings upon His final messenger Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. I will be addressing, inshallah, I'll just keep it brief, about the creed of Abu Hanifa rahimahullah ta'ala. Abu Hanifa rahimahullah was of the great Imams. And what's so special, especially about Abu Hanifa, is that chronologically he was the first of the four Imams. And as well, his position, his geographical position, he was in Iraq, in Al-Kufa, which made the time that he came in and the place that he came in very special and unique. And Abu Hanifa, his full name was Nu'man ibn Thabit. And he was one of the great renowned scholars of Al-Kufa, and he was widely accepted and respected at his time and after his time. The scholars unanimously agree to his esteem in scholarship. And Ali ibn Asim, he said, if the knowledge of Abu Hanifa was weighed against the knowledge of all other scholars at his time, then Abu Hanifa would outweigh all the other scholars put together. Ibn al-Mubarak, he said that Abu Hanifa had the most understanding of all the scholars. Al-Shafi'i, Imam al-Shafi'i, he said about Abu Hanifa, he said all of the scholars are indebted to Abu Hanifa. All of the scholars are indebted to Abu Hanifa because all of them learned from Abu Hanifa, directly or indirectly, and benefited from him. Al-Kharibi, he mentioned something, this statement is very important. He said, anyone who speaks ill of Abu Hanifa, either he is someone who's jealous of him or he is ignorant of his reality. Okay? And this is something very important because to many scholars they had opponents who were jealous of them or people who were ignorant about them and attributed things to them that was not correct, and would attribute things to certain scholars, and this is, Abu Hanifa is one of them, and many scholars that would attribute things to esteemed scholars so that they can justify their positions. And perhaps I will mention examples of that. Imam al-Dhahabi, rahimahullah, the great historian who wrote Sir A'lam al-Nubala, which is one of the greatest encyclopedias that speaks about the biographies of scholars, he said about Imam Abu Hanifa that he was the leader in fiqh, in jurisprudence. And he researched the minute details of fiqh. And this is something that has no doubt in. And he mentioned other great things about him. And Abu Hanifa rahimahullah, he died as a martyr. He said he died as a martyr in 150 of the Hijrah, year 150. So you can see that Abu Hanifa rahimahullah died in the 2nd century of the Islamic Hijrah year. And this is very important. How the relative early stage of Abu Hanifa is very important because in terms of Aqidah, when we talk about Aqidah, there is the belief in the creed of the Muslims, but a lot of the time when we talk about Aqidah is their stances to the new understandings or the deviated beliefs that have arisen. So, for example, some of the early deviated ways was, for example, the Khawarij. Okay? And what was the stance of the Khawarij, of the scholars against the Khawarij? Did they agree with them or did they disapprove of them? Of the Qadariyah, those who are deviating in the issues of Qadr and the predestiny of Allah, did they agree with them or did they stand against them? And Al-Jahmiyyah, for example, those that deny the attributes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But there were some other deviated groups that had arisen after the time of some of these scholars, especially Abu Hanifa, since he was very early on. And he did not live in the time of some of the great creedal conflicts that existed among the Muslims. He was present in some of them, but others he wasn't present. That's why he had no comment about these. Another point about Abu Hanifa rahimahullah is that generally the scholars did not make a point to record their knowledge. Because as we discussed with Sheikh Zuhair in the introduction, they weren't people who were set and had an agenda to promote their teachings. They thought so little of themselves, rahimahumullah ta'ala, even though they were great scholars. And they feared that people would take their rulings and their words as gospel, so to speak. And they feared that that would happen, even though eventually, by the qadr of Allah, that happened to some extent. So Imam Abu Hanifa, as many of the scholars, as we said, would refrain from recording things themselves. And a lot of what is recorded is narrations of the Imams and not the words of the Imams. So that's generally in their field of expertise, which is in the area of fiqh and deriving rulings of the Sharia. Now, in terms of Aqeedah, Imam Abu Hanifa didn't delve into the issue of Aqeedah and write and spend a lot of time in this. And especially, he didn't write anything in Aqeedah. He didn't, for example, write refutations of deviant beliefs in the time. But there is a book that is attributed to Abu Hanifa, even it's not certain that Abu Hanifa wrote this book or that it was written under his guidance, but is attributed and widely accepted that is attributed to Abu Hanifa, and this book is called Al-Fiqh Al-Akbar. And in this Fiqh Al-Akbar, there are two issues that we can derive from it. One is proof that Abu Hanifa rahimahullah, he had views in Aqeedah that agreed completely with the way of the Salaf and the understanding of the Salaf and the people of Hadith, and the acceptance of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's attributes and belief in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala as the early generations of the Muslims is. Because he, Abu Hanifa, as I mentioned, died in year 150, and so he was part of the early generation of the Muslims. And some have mentioned that Abu Hanifa, he met some of the Sahaba and others disputed, but at the very least he would have been one, if not a tabi'i, then he would have been of the tabi'in. So of the things that are mentioned in Fiqh Al-Akbar is that he mentioned about the issue of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the loftiness of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And it's mentioned in Fiqh Al-Akbar, من اعتقد بأن الله ليس في السماء فقد كفر. Whoever believes that Allah is not in the heavens has disbelieved, because this is in complete contradiction with what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has said in the Quran and what the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam has said about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So this is mentioned in Al-Fiqh Al-Akbar and attributed to Abu Hanifa rahimahullah ta'ala, and this is in clear corresponds clearly with the Aqeedah of the Salaf. Now, there is other statements, especially in regards to his belief in Iman, which is mentioned, that is mentioned in Al-Fiqh Al-Akbar, that he says that Iman does not increase or decrease. Okay? And many of the Ahnaf, many of the Hanafis have adopted this view as well, and because many of the Hanafis, especially like many of the people of the followers of the other madhabs, that adopt the views of their Imams verbatim, and they hold on to these views. And that's why, even if we say that it cannot be proven that Abu Hanifa said this himself or adopted this himself, but it is clearly adopted by the majority of the Hanafi scholars throughout the ages, that they hold this view that Iman doesn't increase or decrease. And if we can argue that we can measure the opinions of the scholar by the opinions of his students, but that is something that is inconclusive. And there are some of the Hanafi scholars. For example, there was a scholar in the 6th century, in the 6th Hijra century, who wrote a poem in Aqeedah, and it's called Bath al-Amani fi Tawheed al-Jalali. And he says in this poem affirming the loftiness of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, he says, وَرَبُّ الْعَرْشِ فَوْقَ الْعَرْشِ لَكِنْ بلا وصف التمكن والاتصال. He says, affirming again what I mentioned earlier about the loftiness of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and that Allah ta'ala is above the throne. He mentioned, and the Lord of the throne is above the throne, but He is not attributed to be established or connected to the throne. So this again affirms the aqidah of the Salaf, that affirms the loftiness of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and generally this can be derived as a extended principle of accepting the attributes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala without comparing Allah to His creation or denying the attributes or rejecting the attributes. And generally that this was the belief of all of the Imams. They were of pure creed and they did not adopt the creeds of the deviated groups by and large. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala have mercy on Imam Abu Hanifa and have mercy on all of the Imams. Wallahu a'lam wa sallallahu sallam ala nabiyyina Muhammad wa alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam.
Al Bayan Radio, the voice of Ahl Sunnati wal Jama'ah.